Over to you, Swati. Please take over.
Greetings to everyone. Thank you all for joining us from different parts of the world. I am Swati Mehta and I am from India, teaching here at a public university at Guru Nanak Dev University, Amritsar. Today, my job is to moderate this very important session of In Conversation series of CRIS Network. So, CRIS is a consortium for research on innovation studies. It's an acronym which no doubt have association with Christopher Freeman. CRIS was started in 2021 with a series of lectures on innovation systems, commemorating the birth centenary year of Christopher Freeman and continued beyond that due to the popular demand. Under CRIS, we are a group of early career researchers from different parts of the world who met at different platforms that GlobalX community has provided. Professor Venkat Ludwal is our patron and guide, and Dr. Rajesh is one who has initiated this platform connecting us all. So, yeah, a big thanks to them. And we ran several series for the benefit of early career innovation researchers, especially those from the countries of global south where competence building opportunities are limited. So, in conversation series was actually started with a promising motive of connecting and understanding the academics, intellectual, and personal growth stories of prominent scholars who are working on the broad and evolving field of innovation studies. We record these conversations for archival purposes to be used as a learning material for students and researchers. We had our first event in December 2021, wherein we featured Professor Richard Nelson, which was interviewed by Professor Franco Malerva. Subsequently, we had done around 15 in conversations, and all recordings are available on our website, chris-is.org, along with many other important and interesting materials in the field. So all these materials are available on our website free of cost for the greater benefit of fellow researchers and students. So we are self-motivated and work on pro bono basis with zero funding. But such a program actually need some sort of help and a platform like Zoom, which we have been using. And for that, we thankfully acknowledge the support of University of Malaya North South Research Center, and for this we are grateful to Professor Angathaparan Bhaskaran and Professor Mamumushi for their kind gesture. Today we are at the 16th event in this series, and we have with us Professor Jan Fagerberg from the University of Oslo, a very prominent scholar in the field of innovation studies, innovation policy, climate policy, and of course, economic development. So we welcome you, Professor Fagerberg. And Professor Fagerberg
Sure.
is going to be interviewed by another very prominent scholar, Professor Ben Martin. It's my great pleasure to welcome you, Professor Ben Martin. Professor Martin is a professor of science and technology policy studies at SPU, where he has also served as a director from 1997 to 2004, and he is the editor of Research Policy, a very prominent journal in our field. He has also pioneered the notion of technology foresight. And more recently, he carried out research on the benefits from government funding of basic research, changing nature and role of university, and evolution of the field of innovation studies. So I welcome both of you for this conversation series. We also have with us Professor MARYANN from Arizona State University and Professor BART VERSPAGEN from UNU Merit, Netherlands. So a few words about the structure of how this today's event is going to be organized. This event is actually 2 hours long and is organized into two halves with 1 hour duration each, which is separated by a 5 minute short break. So in the first hour, there would be conversation between Professor Fagerberg and Professor Ben Martin. And after the break, our eminent panelists, Professor Mariam and Professor Bart, will ask questions to Professor Fagerberg. And finally, the session will be open for questions from the audiences. So for the audiences, please keep on typing your questions in the chat box. We'll pick them up and we'll call you upon at the end of the program to ask your questions yourself. So this is the broad structure, and with this, I once again welcome each one of you, and I hand over the stage to Professor Ben Martin. Professor Martin, please.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to the CRIS lecture organisers. This is a great initiative that the wider community is benefiting from. I should also thank Jan for inviting me to be his discussant, and also thank MARYANN and BART for being the panelists. My apologies to all of you. I'm suffering from a bit of a cold at present, so I'll keep my introduction relatively brief and let Jan speak for himself. But very briefly, I've known Jan for about 30 years. During that time, he's been a key figure in the field of innovation studies. We'll be hearing more about the exact nature of his contributions as we go through this. He's also been a friend, a source of inspiration. And I think one thing we don't talk a lot about is values. I think he and I share a lot of values that we also share with some of the founders of the field, like Chris Freeman, Dick Nelson, Bendaka Lundvall, and others. And those values, I think, are important in keeping the innovation studies community together. I can name other fields where you don't have the same friendly, cooperative, open approach to things. It's much more individualistic, competitive, and sometimes a bit too much macho behavior in it. But that's not our field, and for that we have to thank some of the founders, but also people like Jan who kept those values going. In terms of background, I'll let Jan speak in more detail about this, but very briefly, an economics degree at the University of Bergen, a period as a civil servant, which I want to explore a bit more with him, and what he learned and why he moved on. Then a PhD, or a DPhil, as it was then known, at SPRU, and then subsequent career director of TIC, Technology Innovation and Culture Centre at the University of Oslo. A period that I also remember fondly, as I'm sure will MARYANN and BART, the Advanced Research Centre at the Academy of Sciences in Oslo, where we spent many a nice time discussing what was going on in our field, as well as wider things. Some of the other things that he's participated in along the way, I think one that forms part of his legacy is the North Sea workshops for PhD students, given a lot of attention to bringing on younger career researchers. During all of this, his focus has been on the role of innovation for growth, development, and more recently, sustainability transitions. Worked on a number of themes within that: national innovation systems with Chris Freeman, Bendaka Lundvall, Richard Nelson, and others, innovation policy, and work that I've collaborated with him on the field of innovation studies, how it's emerged, how it's developed, and how it's changing over time. He's probably most well known for the Oxford Handbook of Innovation, which, for those of you who do not know it, is not on his bookshelves. It should be behind him, but there it is, 600 pages, the definitive authoritative textbook on innovation. It's owned about 4,000 citations or so, and his introductory chapter alone has earned over 3,500 citations. We'll come later on a bit more to explore the background to that and what it's done. Other influential work includes technology and international differences in growth rates, international competitiveness, national innovation systems, a technology gap approach to why growth rates differ, innovation studies, and the emerging structure of a new scientific field. But we'll go through some of those in more detail in a minute. But Jan, can I begin about your family background, early schooling, education, and so on? Can you tell us a little bit about that and the influence of various people that might have played a part in your career trajectory?
Yes, thank you, Ben. Yes, I'm happy to. It's actually the first time I have been asked about my family background, so this is a real opportunity for me, which I will exploit to the utmost. Well, the first important thing to say about my family in Norway is that they were immigrants. So my father was born by two Danish immigrants that came to Norway in search for jobs after the First World War. And he actually met my mother after the war in the UK, and she was Swedish. So I don't have any real Norwegian relatives. And as many immigrant families, this family cherished very much their original cultures. So my grandfather and grandmother, they were more Danish than the ordinary Danes. So we had Danish flags in Christmas. We sang Danish songs. We had Danish aquavit and all these kinds of things. So in a bit, that I think this gave me, if not an international, so at least a Nordic outlook from the very start. I traveled a lot around with my family, having vacations and so on in Denmark and Sweden, and later in life, about well, when I was 25, 30. I joined an organization called the Nordic Summer University, where I became the president, and that was really a networking organization. And one of the topics they took up was political economy, which I joined, and many of the people that I have collaborated with later, like for example Bengt Lundvall, I actually met through that framework for the first time. And it also allowed me to meet Chris Freeman, which I will come back to. The other important thing about my family in Norway is that they all were immensely practical people, but none of them were academics. So there were carpenters and mechanics and even one cook. My father went to a polytechnics and had a bachelor engineering degree, and he was immensely proud of that. But universities, I can never remember that we talked about universities in my family, and that was especially interesting or anything. And so I never had the idea that working in a university was something that normal people could do. And that was not a goal for me either. But I was from maybe around 6-7 years old, I became a news junkie. So I listened to radio and the read newspapers every day, so I learned to read that way. So when I came to school, they thought that I had been taught to read in forehand, but that was not right. I taught myself to read newspapers, and so I became very interested in politics and issues like that. And I thought that when I went to secondary school, that the possible goal for me could be to be a journalist. So I started writing occasional articles in newspapers, and also there was a newspaper at the school, so I contributed quite a lot there about various topics. And I got some temporary jobs, worked as a substitute in a daily in Oslo, both before I graduated from secondary school and afterwards. And then during 1 year in military service, I was working in the press office of the Defense Department. I was sent around on all kinds of strange things. For example, to making a series of articles on the Swiss military. So that was very enjoyable.
Along
So
the way, were there any particular teachers or university lecturers that had a strong and lasting influence on you?
and I think that if I can take it back a little bit, because before I entered university, and the reason why I entered university was that when I worked in the leading daily newspaper in Oslo for quite a while, in fact, and I worked on the desk at night. But once I had the opportunity to talk to the top editor, and he was quite impressed by something I had done. And then I asked him, what would be the right background for being a journalist? And there was a school for journalism, but he said that there was no point in going to that. But what I could do was to go to university for a while and take up a few subjects. So I followed that advice, and I picked 3 subjects that I wanted to take, all at the undergraduate level, and that was political science, it was history, and it was economics. So I started with political science at the University of Oslo, and I liked that. And then I went took history on a small regional high school, it was called, but a small university in southern Norway, and that was immensely interesting. So now I had more or less became hooked on academia. And then I took economics at the University of Bergen, which was the only university at that time that offered undergraduate teaching in economics. And because if you went to the university in Oslo, you could only study economics from the first term to the last term. There was no possibility of taking just 1 year or 2 years. The leading professor there at the time, he said that they would starting to offer undergraduate economics when the medicine department often offered undergraduate courses in advanced medical disciplines. That's the way they looked at it. But I found economics extremely boring. It was, and I was struck by the strangeness of the approach. I mean, these axiomatic conditions, these ideas about, people behaved in this way or that way, and they gave priority to this and that, and from that you could deduct a whole lot of things. When I felt that I knew very well that most of this was rubbish. But I had to convince myself that it was important to learn anyway. So I convinced myself that this was kind of aesthetic discipline, a little bit like studying arts. Or music, so that you had to learn the system, and it wasn't so important what it actually was. But if I can continue.
Well, I was going to just interrupt. You say you were dissatisfied with the sort of standard economic approach that was being taught then. Were there particular books or particular authors that were more influential on your thinking?
Yes, I'm coming to that, because of course this was the 70s, and this was the years of the student movement. It was also the years of Marxism at the universities, and I was also part of a socialist group at the university, and they had a philosophy, and I joined into that, of kind of double qualification. So you had to study the traditional stuff, even if it was very boring, but then you should also devote a lot of time to alternative ideas, an alternative type of education, which was self-organized. And what I did was that I followed a course that actually went over 3 semesters, 1.5 year, in capital, Marx Capital. So we read it from the first page to the very end. So I think there were 30 people in the beginning and 5 people in the end. And it was led by an assistant professor at the philosophy department, Hans Ebbing. And I think that I will credit him with actually learning me to think. So that course was very fundamental for me. But we also read other things that were, you know, like Luigi Passinetti's work, or Kaldor, for example, post-Keynesian theory. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's now move on. You became a civil servant. I believe you worked in more than one ministry. Can you tell us a little bit about what positions, what responsibilities you held, what sort of issues you dealt with, and what you learned from all of that?
Yes, it all was completely, in a way, it started out completely arbitrary, because I had finished my undergraduate degree, and I had decided to major in economics, because the history department in Oslo didn't accept the proposal that I had for them. So that's why I became an economist, almost by accident. But while doing so, I also decided that I wanted to start working, having some income, having an apartment, and so on. So, and a life besides the university. So I applied for various jobs. And I then got a job in the Ministry of Environment. And it was supposed to be a relatively subordinate position. It should be part-time, about half-time or something like that. And I was working in the information department. And here, of course, I benefited from my background as an earlier part-time journalist, and having worked in the Ministry of Defense in the information department and so on. So it was not my Marxism that brought me in there, or my education, but in general, but it was more type of you know, my background. But what happened was that the boss of this section in the Ministry of Environment that I joined, he quit his job very quickly after I came. And then the general director of the ministry came to me and said, I heard that you are a quite clever guy, and so you can take on this job while we think about what to do. So suddenly I was there managing a department with several employees and handling the relations of the Ministry of Environment to the press and so on. And the minister at the time was Gro Harlem Brundtland, that you have heard about. And she was very activist and determined in a way, and I became a secretary for the leadership group in the ministry. So every as head of the information department, so every week I had a meeting with her and so on. Then the most what I say, maybe most difficult period during this time was that this was the time of a blowout in the North Sea. So there was a oil blowout in the North Sea, and nobody knew what would happen. There were nightly meetings of experts. It was very delicate to handle the relationships to the press and so on. And I was in the middle of it, with virtually no experience or background on the matter. But this was not really my goal in life to end up there. And I was representing the ministry in various other types of organizations and so on, giving money so I had a lot of responsibilities, but I took leave of absence after 3 years, and then I finished my master's degree in economics and applied for a job in the Ministry of Finance, and I got it.
So what was your role at the Ministry of Finance?
Yes, that was in what I call the planning department, because that's not a concept that probably will be used nowadays, but at that time that was very popular. So it was the department for medium-term forecasting and projections. They were running models and so on, doing a model both for 5, 6 years, but also up to 10, 20, 30 years. And every 4th year, they made a white paper for the government based on this type of work, but also with contributions from all the other ministries. So that basically was the job of the department. And I tried to stay a little bit out of the more sensitive areas. So I became responsible for international trade and international trade projections, and also the international maritime sector. The ministries work on that, and that also led me to the OECD. So I followed the general director of the department to the OECD. He was chairman of one of the working parties there for medium-term planning, and I also stayed in the OECD for I think a month or something as a trainee or during that period. And so it was I learned a lot. And the things that I needed most was the kind of things I had, more or less skipped during my studies, like econometrics and theory of international trade and so on. So it was a crash course for me, but it was very rewarding in many ways. But what happened?
Yes, why did you stop and come to SPRU?
What happened was that when I entered, there was a social democratic goal. And the minister, Per Kleppe, he had earlier been Minister of Finance and also the chief economist of the trade organization. So he was a very, a person that actually I personally liked very much. But then there was an election, and we got a conservative government, and then the general director of the department, with which I had, I would say, a kind of love and hate relationship. But when we got a minister from the Conservative Party, and this general director was known to be somewhat to the left, he tried to adapt very strongly to the new political tendencies. And then some of the people that he had recruited, like myself, were not any longer so useful. So that's when it transcended from the love period to the hate period. So that was not so pleasant, but I took the signal. And I was allowed to do a small project on competitiveness and economic structure, industrial structure, as I called it. And that actually were ideas that I had picked up from Bengt Åge Lundvall, that I had joined in the Nordic Summer University, in which I was active at the same time in parallel with this. So I made I worked for a month or so became a working paper from the ministry. And then when things became difficult, I sent this as an application to the Research Council for a 3-year scholarship, which I got for some reason. So that was the beginning of my academic career.
But you decided to come to SPRU. How had you heard of SPRU and Chris Freeman? Where was that part of the journey?
I had heard of SPRU. and Chris Freeman. I think mainly through these contacts with the Nordic Summer University and the group in University of Aalborg. I think some of them are here. So people like Bengt-Åke Lundvall, but also Espen Slott Andersen and Bent Dahlum and others. And I was chairman of one of the study groups in this Nordic Summer University, in addition to being president of the association for a while. So I organized a seminar in Denmark and in Helsingør, if I remember correctly, in 1983. And there, Chris Freeman and Carlota Perez, they were invited and they came. And I think it was Bent Dahlum, who is not with us anymore, unfortunately, who actually was the contact person there. He had been in Spru on a shorter visit or something. So Chris came, and Chuck and Carlota came, and they were very enthusiastic. And we actually published a paper that came out of that, and I will now show that second. So this is in this little publication journal that we published in Norwegian. Chris and Carlota had a paper, and it came out in 1984. So that was the connection. But I mean, I wasn't sure that, you know, this necessarily was the right approach. So when I got this stipend and could do what I wanted, I first joined the research department in the Central Bureau of Statistics, but I wasn't so popular there either. So eventually I got a position in the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. But then I had a lot of money that was left from this 3 years grant, and I was able to use that for making the arrangement with Spru. But before I got to Spru, I traveled around Europe to see what there were. So I tried out 3 different approaches, which could be useful for me. One was what was called the regulation school in France. So I was half a year in Paris at Sepremat with Robert Boyer. And then these neo-Ricardian groups in Italy. So I went to a summer course there in 83 or 84. But I had objections to both of these streams because I thought that their analysis was very static. So they were not able to explain change in a way that I would like to see, while I saw that the kind of Schumpeterian thinking that dominated in Spru and with Chris Freeman was much more relevant in that regard. So in a way, I scanned the entire theoretical supply, because the neoclassical I knew in forehand, so that was not necessarily to work a lot on. And I chose Spru because I thought it was the best and most relevant place. And yeah.
Can you say a bit about who you worked with at Spru and what you worked on?
Yes. I mean, my connection with Spru was as a part-time student. So I think I was accepted in 1985 or something like that. That was after I had joined a group of Norwegian economic historians who toured British universities, including Spru. And I said I would join if I was able to give a seminar. And to the surprise of everybody, SPRU accepted me to give a seminar. And what I presented there was the first draft of this paper that became published in Research Policy, Technology Gap Approach to Why Growth Rates Differ. And I remember Keith Pavitt was there, Chris Freeman was there, Luc Soete was there, everybody was there, and it was very well received. And
Can you just
after,
tell the audience, what does a technology gap approach mean?
it basically means that for countries behind the frontier, there is in principle a lot of knowledge, a lot of technology that is already developed in more advanced environments, and which they don't have to reinvent. So they can benefit from that to change their economies and grow faster than the more established industrial world.
So that links in with the work on catching up then.
Yeah, so this is the work on catching up. So this was a paper on catching up, and what was maybe new in that paper was that it brought innovation, what I think originally innovative efforts, more into the picture, because drawing on Schumpeter, I had this idea that to catch up, it's not sufficient to just import technologies or artifacts from abroad, but that you actually have to develop capabilities for doing so. And that has been a main issue for me all the time. I mean, the importance of capability building for economic development. But when Chris Freeman saw this paper, he said, "Have you thought about publishing it?" And I said no, because that was true. I hadn't thought about publishing it. And then he put his hand on it and he said like this, and he said, "Consider it submitted." That's how it happened.
And what did the referees say about it?
Well, they had some comments, but they were basically positive. There were some minor things, but yeah, not very important.
I think our referees have got tougher over time, but that's another story.
That's probable, yes.
And a year later, you published in the Economic Journal a paper on international competitiveness. So tell us a bit how the argument developed in that second paper.
Yes. Well, this was the paper that was more closely related to the project about competitiveness that for which I had got funding, so the paper on the earlier paper on catching up, in a sense, was a kind of first take on the issue on my part. So, and in the competitiveness paper, I did in many ways exactly the same, just that I explained export growth or changes in market shares for exports and changes in market shares for imports on the domestic market by some of the same variables. So that was the possibility for importing knowledge and technology for abroad, indigenous technological efforts, capability building, and also some other factors, investment. And yeah, and then what I did was that then what I did in the paper was that I related the exports and imports through a balance of trade equilibrium, so that you had to balance your trade in the long run. So that means that exports and imports had to be brought in line in the long run, and from that you could also deduct the kind of economic growth relationship that I have already studied in the paper for research policy as a kind of reduced term equation. So it was a more elaborate version of the same model.
And then a few years later, you followed up with one in the Journal of Economic Literature on technology and international differences in growth rates. So was that just summarizing all that you'd learned in that area?
Yeah, I always I always like to you know make overviews of things, interpretations of broader areas of literatures and insights and so on. So I did this mostly for my own amusement, but I started doing a shorter paper. So of course it was related to the same ideas as in the two papers that you mentioned, but it was more related to the kind of broad reading that I had done before writing these papers. So it was a kind of, and then I sent that paper to Moses Abramowitsch, and I had became befriended with him in a way because I had invited him to a seminar in Norway, and he was he liked that paper, but he then said that, you know, that can you make something that is twice as long on the same topic?
Okay.
Yeah. So then I had to do that, and under his guidance, and of course that guidance brought up a lot of things that I hadn't thought about before. So I learned a lot from that.
Okay.
So working with Moses Abramowitsch was one of the things that you know I really appreciated the possibility of doing.
Okay, well, I'm conscious of the time, so let's jump forward 10 years. The Oxford Handbook on Innovation. Can you tell us about the origins of this, how it was organized, and what you think it's achieved?
Yes. Well, one of the things that happened when I was a student at SPRU was that I was invited by Chris Freeman into the Technical Change and Economic Theory project that he had with Giovanni Dosi and Luc Soete and Nathan Rosenberg and many others. And I had a short chapter in there on differences in growth rate and technology, which was in a way based quite closely on these two other papers that you have mentioned. But I really like the setting. This idea of bringing people that, you know, had something to tell each other, but still were different, came from different places, different traditions, different academic environments, different disciplines even. So I wanted to replicate that process, but not in the same way. So and it was something that I had learned, that there were many people that were interested in innovation, but they did not talk about it in the same way. They did not use the same concepts, and sometimes, you know, people did not really understand what the others were talking about, simply because there were conceptual differences and differences in backgrounds, and I wanted to take a step to reduce those differences and produce a kind of synthetic overview of the role of innovation in the society and the economy. So very much in the way that Freeman and Associates had done with this book, Technological Change and Economic Theory in the field of economics. So that was the goal, and so then I based on the kind of networking that I had done in the period between my stay in SPRU and this handbook, which was about 10 years, I believe, maybe a little bit more, 15 years. I assembled a group and people that were interested, quite different people. I mean, historians, sociologists, and economists, geographers. And then I applied for money actually from the EU. So because I said to them that, you have started to support this kind of work, and now it's time to find out what has happened and make a status and so on. This was the EU's TCR program. So it was an accompanying venture for that program, and I got the money and I organized the project, and here we are.
But those of us who've edited a book know it's sometimes hard work persuading different or difficult authors to play along and so on. Is there any message you would give for younger researchers who are listening today about how best to manage an edited book of this scale?
Well, I think that what I did was quite original, because my idea was that that if we started with full papers, then it will never work. So so we simply had a series of seminars, and another 2 seminars, I think, and in the first of these, people were just asked to provide abstracts. Actually, I wrote an abstract of each paper, 25 or whatever it was. I wrote it, and then I sent it to them and said, this is the abstract of your chapter, and now you are invited to comment on that. Some people liked that, and some people disliked it enormously. But it worked, and then I brought in other people from the audience as commentators. So for each contribution, we had a panel of 3 people that commented on it, and from there came the paper. So it was not only I think it was quite different from most edited volumes, because it was a process that was constructed to lead to something that was where the individual pieces are part of a bigger whole, and everybody, to a larger or smaller extent, actually accepted this bigger picture, and that their work was part of that. So that was in many ways difficult but quite rewarding process. And then one thing that I did, which I think was very important, was that I brought in the most senior living economist at the time, namely Richard Nelson, and together with David Mowry as co-editors. And everybody admired, of course, Dick Nelson, and that also led to what made it much easier to enforce the discipline for the process.
Okay, that's some useful lessons there. Let's skip on a number of years again to, I think it was around 2007-8, the Advanced Research Centre on Innovation. How did that come about? What was it trying to do, and what came out of it? Indeed, I want to lead on to your work on the field of innovation studies in due course, but tell us a bit about the background and what it was trying to achieve.
Well, I almost forgotten about that, but it was an arrangement that they have in Norway for supporting basic research, and so it was an attempt to do a kind of follow up in a way on the handbook, but maybe with an even broader profile. So I remember we had a psychologist working in the team, in the end, I think maybe I mean, it was very enjoyable. And it worked through workshops and special issues of journals and so on. So a lot came out of it, but maybe not an equally strong message as had been the case with the handbook. But you were there, so you can say something about it if you like.
Well, it was certainly very enjoyable, and I've still got fond memories, not least of listening to seminars by the two other teams. One of them was the chemistry of muscles, and the other was the sources of authority of Viking chieftains, or something along those lines. And I remember discussions over lunch with people from these two other teams, which were part of this process that we went through. But anyway, it was about this time you were beginning to focus on our field. You were working with BART on innovation studies, the emerging structure of a new scientific field. So I'd like you to say a little bit about how you see the field of innovation studies as having evolved, and indeed what you consider to be the main advances during the time you worked in it.
Yes. Well, when I started, you know, my knowledge about the literature on innovation was from the literature. So it was from reading. So I didn't know much about the academic groups and so on, the organizational features of the field, if indeed you can call it a field. But as you say, during that period, I became interested in trying to explore that. And through with the help of BART, we actually were able to organize this Explore project, which also was a part of a broader European Union research framework. So, and in which you also took part, where we tried to map the development of innovation studies over time, identify the most important contributions. We used different, and researchers use different methodologies for that. With BART, I wrote a paper that was based on a network approach and a survey. We also, inspired as I was in my work on handbooks, subsequently there came more handbooks on innovation, and there were some earlier ones on particular aspects of innovation. So, and I collected all of those. And I think at that time it was around 10. With the help of an assistant, I collected all the references and used that actually to identify the most cited works. So in that way, it was able to construct a knowledge base of innovation and to characterize the field, which disciplines these people came from, which countries they came from, what they were interested in, what were the topics they wrote about concerning innovation and so on. And certainly through this work, I realized that the field was much broader than I had imagined. So I think that the kind of intuition that I had when I started with Oxford Handbook Innovation, that it was important to try to bring these different parts of the field of the researchers that study innovation together and have more communication and interaction. That intuition was right. But I also realized that it was a challenging journey ahead. Because creating new fields in science is not something that is particularly easy. especially if you want to establish it with education, doctoral programs, and the like. Because there are some other disciplines out there that some other animals called disciplines that where people might not be entirely happy with you doing so.
Well, this brings us, I'm conscious we've only got about 5 minutes or so left, brings us to how you see the future of the field. And let me map out 1 or 2 scenarios that have been discussed. First of all, in terms of size, I know you and Bart arrived at a figure of 2,000 or 3,000 people at the time working on innovation studies, I think was the figure you had. Now I suspect it's perhaps 5,000 or so around the world who would identify as innovation scholars. There are some who worry that the field will burst apart, that the economists will go off in one direction, the management of technology and innovation people go in another, and so on. I think Dick Nelson has expressed some worries along that score. Another scenario you've hinted at is indeed a tension there between becoming more discipline-like or remaining what I've rudely characterized as an interdisciplinary mongrel sniffing around for new or emerging policy problems that we can address, but not worrying too much about theoretical structure and so on. So I wonder how you see the future of the field, and indeed whether you're optimistic or pessimistic, given that we've got younger researchers in the field listening today who want to know, how you see the future.
Yes, well, I would like to maybe here it could be an idea to bring in Chris Freeman and his view on innovation, because what I have tried to do during my entire career is to propagate that view, and that is a view which sees innovation as a very broad phenomenon. Something that is not only about technology, but also, and it's not only about new ideas, but also about their implementation and exploitation, about diffusion. So you look at the innovation as an entire process. And something that is not only relevant in high-tech companies, but all over the economy, and not only in advanced countries, but also in developing countries and so on. And I think this is a perspective that, in a way, still is revolutionary. I mean, because it raises innovation as an essential phenomenon in all economic and social processes, and it also offers innovation as one of something that politicians may influence. So it may be important for policy in a whole range of areas. So when I think about innovation studies, it's in this sense. I think that so the potential for and since now you could say that there are more in a way challenges in society, in the global society, than there perhaps hasn't ever been. Innovation is as relevant and as important as it has ever been. So I see, a great role both for innovation and for people studying it. Then I would also like to recommend the way Chris Freeman went on to study it, because he studied it empirically. So instead of having all these kind of crazy ideas about where inventions come from and where they come and so on, you actually look at it, and that can inform policy. So I still think this perspective holds immense promise. I don't think it matters so much if you have different parts of the field, or if, for example, innovation in business becomes a subfield in management studies and so on. But what I think is important that the community that is interested in policy and in innovation as a force of change in society and for a better world, that actually that community manages to stick together. Yeah.
Well, that's a very upbeat note. Swati, if we've got a couple of minutes, I'd like just to ask Jan a little bit about what I regard as one of his main legacies. Often when we were talking about what we've contributed, we focus first on research, but I would like to point to the North Sea workshops for doctoral students. Jan, can you say a little bit about these for those who are not familiar with them? And perhaps offer your views on whether this might offer a mechanism for other parts of the world where, again, you have universities with not many students focusing on this, where they benefit from being brought together.
Yeah, the North Sea PhD course.
Yes.
It was actually I would not exaggerate my role in that, but I taught in the first programs, yes, and for quite a while. It's still ongoing. It started with a grant from the Norwegian Research Council, and later it has, I think, mostly been financed by the universities themselves, and it has expanded so that now there are a number of universities across the Nordic area that takes part. And I think it also has been important because it has created a community of people who actually have attended these courses, and that then continue to interact with each other. So yeah.
Well, as I say, I think those contacts which are being fostered amongst the North Sea students are vital ones for ensuring the success of their careers. And I think you, Jan, should be proud of your part in that initiative. And I've certainly enjoyed taking part over the years in it as well. But perhaps we should stop now. I see the time is 2 minutes past, so we've just had about an hour, and I'll hand back to Swati.
Yes. After this great conversation for 1 hour, so it's the time for a quick 5 minutes break. So we will just grab a cup of coffee and just come back within 5 minutes and to start with the second part of our session. So we'll be back. Yeah, it's 32. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have a brief announcement during this break. This is about our next upcoming event. So this event, our 17th conversation in this series is happening on 17th March 2024 at 9 a.m. London time. So in the 17th conversation, we will feature Mark Dodson in a conversation with Andy Davis. And in the panel, we have 3 very important scholars, Amon Salter, Tim Castle, and Marina Yu Zhang. And this panel will be, this program will be moderated by Dilupa Nakantala. So I can see that Professor Mark Dodson and Professor Dilupa Nakantala are here. Welcome to this program. So enjoy the break and let's assemble in another 4 minutes.
Roger, 17th of March is a Sunday, is that correct?
Is it Sunday? Thanks for pointing it out. Let me just check back and I'm sorry, it is 20th March, it is Wednesday. Thanks, Professor Ben Martin, for pointing that out. I made the mistake just copying the 17th event and 17th March. So it is on 20th March. Anyway, no worries. We will circulate it as usual and we will send invitations as usual. You will not miss it. We will make sure. Thank you so much for reminding it, pointing this out. It's on 20th March, Wednesday. Just one moment.
Welcome you back. I think the 5 minutes break is almost over. So having a very, very interesting conversation in the first part between Jen Fagerberg and Professor Ben Martin, the time actually flew. We didn't understand it's been an hour. It was so interesting and interviewing that we just enjoyed. And now we are into the second part of the session. And here again, we have with us Professor MARYANN FELDMAN, and she is a BART professor of public policy and management at Watts College of Public Service and Community Solutions at Arizona State University. She is also the editor of Research Policy and a winner of Global Award for Entrepreneurship Research for her contribution in the study of geography of innovation and commercialization of university research and the role of entrepreneurial activity in the formation of regional industrial clusters. So a very warm welcome to you, Professor Feldman. And this, the second very eminent panelist of this particular part of our session is Professor Bart Verspagen, and he's a professor of macroeconomics of innovation and new technologies at UNU Madrid, Netherlands. Professor Bart was a director of UNU Madrid from 2012 to 2020. And he has worked on the area of economics of technical change and innovation, economic growth and development, evolutionary approaches to economics, international trade and structural change. And he is a managing editor of Journal of Evolutionary Economics. A very, very warm welcome to both of you. So I again request Professor Ben Martin to actually, come over and please take over the stage. Professor Ben Martin and invite.
Thank you very much, Swati. Now, MARYANN, are you happy to go first with your questions for Jan?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very good. Okay. So, Jan, I loved hearing the description of your career and the trajectory that it's taken. And it seemed to me, my interpretation is that the coming to power of the Conservative Party is actually what motivated you to return to graduate school. And I wanted to sort of ask you, this is something we've witnessed, the rise of neoliberalism over the last 50 years, over the course of our careers. And so this has meant that the role of government has been diminished. And we can see these outcomes very pointedly with environmental degradation and also increased income inequality. And so I'd like to ask you how innovation scholars can better make a case for the increased role of government and an active public sector in innovation.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you, MARYANN. First of all, I would say that I think this, to some extent, is an American Anglo-Saxon story. I mean, although neoliberalism is something that exists all over the place and has been quite influential, it hasn't been that to the same extent everywhere. So, so where I live, for example, I don't feel that the government has retracted from all the areas, maybe in the same way as I would have felt if I lived in the US or in the UK. But I think there are important differences there across countries. But I don't think the case for a more active state today is very difficult to make. Because we are now faced with challenges of a collective nature that cannot be solved if states don't take an active role and also cooperate. You see that particularly, I think, with something that interests me a lot, and that is the climate issue. because I think if that problem is not dealt with, then there is a number of other problems that will become very large, and we are all in a mess. So that problem needs to be tackled, and you see that, for example, in the European Union, this looms very large, and even in the US, the state has taken a more active role. It has a strange name, this program, anti-inflation something, but essentially it's about the state engaging more actively with long-run problems through public policy. So I think we are seeing this before our very eyes. So I think the
Right.
state
No,
is,
it's
and especially okay, so sorry, yeah.
No, it's funny because I think that in the US, we, again, this is our national systems of innovation. And so we're so very influenced by the context. The only way that we could pass active industrial policy was to wrap it up in anti-inflation, right? That this was a way of promoting that agenda. And so as we think about, sort of national systems, right now there are two trends I'd like you to talk about. The first is the rise of the sort of digital economy, large digital platforms. I noticed even for this session, there are about 7 people using chatbots and AI assistants to take notes for them. And so this is kind of a homogenization that the technology is forcing on us. I mean, how do you think this will change our views of the national systems?
Yes. Now, first of all, I would say that this is not something I have researched or even written about. So any views that I might have on this may not have a very deep background, but nevertheless, I think I would start to I mean, the reason Chris Freeman, to go back to Chris Freeman. Chris Freeman said that the reason we talk about national innovation systems is only that economists usually don't think about innovation, are not interested in innovation, have nothing to say. If it hadn't been for the fact that they are not interested and know so little, then we didn't have to talk about national systems of innovation. He writes this is one in his papers. And I think there is something to that. I mean that national systems of innovation is not something that necessarily exists. It's an approach. It's a way to look for various aspects of public policy and public activity and private activity that actually matter for innovation and innovation outcomes. And then to do that from a historical perspective. Because countries are different, they have different specialization patterns, they have different types of institutions, and all these things matter for a successful conduct of innovation policy. And I think this is what Chris Freeman meant with when he talked about national systems of innovation. And I think this is the right way to see it. So this whole discussion about whether national systems exist or whether are transnational systems or system this or system that, I think is based on a misunderstanding and misrepresentation of the basic literature in this area. Now, coming now to the role of digital technologies, and this is where I am particularly weak. I must admit that. But I'm not I'm a little bit with Robert Gordon on this. I mean, I think that actually digital technologies in most cases is a kind of process innovation. So I mean, it does not offer much new, but there are the kind of things that we used to do before. We can do it more effectively and with less resources and all that. But it doesn't really change our lives fundamentally. It cannot be compared, you know, to the age of electricity, automobiles, and all that. It's really opened for a new way of life, a new way of economy across various industrial fields and application and so on. Digital technology has none of that. I know that many people are very enthusiastic about it and think that it's terribly interesting. But I'm not one of them. You in a previous formulation of this question, you talked about, that you sent to me, you talked about digital platforms. So then I had to look up what a digital platform was, and I then realized that these are things like Facebook and Amazon and so on, digital software packages that bring various actors together and manage them to have their transactions carried out in a better way than before. But all this is well, but I mean, does it really change the way that that public policy, the public sectors, various groups in society can interact with each other and in innovation in a fundamental sense? I don't think so. I think it has a number of other effects. I mean, when something becomes very cheap, you do a lot more of it. And so people run around with their mobile phones all the time and do kinds of things that they shouldn't do. When I was young, there were people in Nigeria sending out letters to people about fortunes that they could earn and so on, fraud. And this has become much more effective and much more trustworthy and so on. It certainly has been important for the field of international crime. So that's probably the business sector that is most affected by these platforms, I think, and enormously strengthened by them. And then, of course, the police and government and so on have to react to that, and God knows where it ends. But it's not something I see as especially positive and encouraging for the future of mankind. Yeah, I think this was a very bad reply, probably.
No. I mean,
Yes.
I think that it's something that is certainly on a lot of people's minds, and they're, we're waiting. This is happening in real time. But it seems to me that there is this inherent tension between globalization and the global economy, the things that we need to solve environmental problems, and yet then sort of the way in which we react as nations. And so you could see that these platforms could have a positive influence if they coordinate communities and facilitate trust, but it doesn't seem to be moving in that direction, unfortunately.
That's not also my impression, yes.
Very good. So Bart, I will yield to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Marianne, and hello to all of you. Before we continue the question and answer sequence, let me make a sort of personal observation, which I was reminded of when Ben was talking to Jan in the first hour of our session here. Jan went over his career and all the things that he did, and of course I remember all of those very well, because his PhD thesis was published on the day that I started mine. so I was very much aware of all the things that he was writing. But the thing I think that did not come out very well in that conversation is also how Jan, at a personal level, really was a very generous person in terms of providing opportunities for other and especially younger people, like I was myself at one point, because in addition to publishing all that great work, he also all the time brought all these young people to the fore and gave them the opportunity to, do their own thing and make their own contributions. And he very generously used those, commented upon those, and provided space for that. So that's something I just wanted to say, and I think it's something that is important and that we see in all the sort of big figures in our field. With that as a personal note, let me continue where you left, MARYANN, which is on the topic of climate change, innovation, the environment, and so on. And this is something that you, Jan, have worked on a lot in the last couple of years of your work. And I wonder whether you could tell us how you feel that the emergence of this problem, this climate problem, this environmental problem, has influenced and should influence in the future this field of innovation studies that we are discussing. So can you tell us a little bit about how you feel innovation studies can help to provide a possible solution for these problems, how it has done that, or maybe how it has not done that? Can you give us a few of your impressions on that?
Yes, thank you, Bart. Well, it's correct that I have written about this issue recently, and the reason for that is, of course, that I see as I mentioned earlier, the climate challenge as an essential challenge to tackle. This is, of course, not the only challenge. When you mention that, the people always come with all these other challenges. But then I say that we have a modular problem here. And if we cannot solve the climate challenge, we will not be able to solve any of these other challenges. So that is in a kind, being able to tackle that issue is a precondition for tackling a number of other issues that have to do with the broader relationship to nature and so on. And it is a problem that I think is solvable. And it's solvable with the help of innovation. Then again, I think of innovation in the broad sense advocated by Freeman. I mean, not only technological innovation, but also adaptation, implementation, but also social and organizational change. I mean, changing the way you organize transport, housing, that's also innovation. It fits the definition of innovation perfectly. And many of the same factors that matter, the extent to which other innovations succeed, they also matter in these cases. So I think what researchers of innovation studies should do, researchers of innovation, is to go into these various areas and study them very closely. I mean, these various processes that matter for the ability to solve the climate change issue, because only in this way will we be able to get things right.
But of course, I cannot disagree with any of what you said there. But on the other hand, it's also true that if we take this vision to the extreme, then of course all change is going to be innovation, right? So if we want to change things, then by definition we would need innovation. But can you comment maybe a little bit more on what particular kinds of innovation do you think are most crucial for solving this problem, and how can that kind of innovation be achieved? What kind of policies do we need? And perhaps as a sort of more personal footnote, could you also reflect a little bit on how we as a field can organize ourselves in different ways to help fight climate change? Because, for example, we're having this virtual meeting, which I think is going to be better for the climate than flying to one central place. But that's maybe one of the things that we can do. So can you reflect on that?
Yes. Well, I think that actually the problem may look big, but and it is big, but it's also simple. And the reason why it's simple is that the reason that has to do with why we have climate change. I mean, around 80% of global climate gases, they stem from fossil fuels. So 100 years ago, the world became addicted to fossil fuels. We had a lot of innovations building on fossil fuels. And so we could say that the capitalism that we live in today, the economic and technological and social system, it's all based on fossil fuels. And this is what we have to change. And that is, of course, a tremendous challenge. But there is something interesting here. And that is that the kind of solution to that, the other way of doing that, it existed already 100 years ago. Namely, that is electricity and renewable electricity. So it's not a totally new idea, but it's just that it was selected that way. And here we can use our Schumpeterian upbringing. We perfectly understand these processes, that something that looked much better and looked to be much cheaper, namely fossil fuels, came along, and therefore these previous technological trajectories related to electrification were not pursued to the extent that we would have liked to see today. But they have caught on. I mean, and that is very much related to policy. The fact that, for instance, solar and wind technologies now are considered as the cheapest ways to produce electricity in most contexts by a big number. This was not something that was conceived realistic 10 or 20 years ago. When I started to look into this issue, then the problem with solar energy was that it was extremely costly. And Germans were complaining that the government supported this extremely costly technology. But when they had done it for 10 years, then it was the cheapest of all possible alternatives in the world. So that tells you something about what public policy can achieve. So simply what we have to do is to do this on a big scale. So I don't think in principle, I mean, it's a process of technological and organizational change. But it's not impossible to do. And it's very easy to understand what needs to be done. It's just very hard to do. Because you have to change the basis of a civilization, which is a hard thing to do, but which can be done. And I don't think that, it is a question of personal salvation necessarily. I mean, that you have to stop traveling and, only be at home I mean, there are many things in our own personal lives that we can do that is good for the climate. But we don't necessarily need a new climate religion or anything in that sense. I don't think that, for example, it will be impossible in the future to fly with air travel, or that boats cannot travel the ocean or anything like that. It's just to be a little bit more expensive. and then perhaps people will choose to do a number of things differently, or encouraging, but exploiting things that are more nearby and so on. But it's not that the whole world that we have developed, the modern world, is going to fall apart because of this problem. It can't be solved without having that kind of consequences.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for that relatively optimistic sort of outlook. I'm looking at Ben and Swati now. Should we open up to the general audience, or can I ask one question, which on my part is something I'm really curious to know, but I certainly also want to give others an opportunity.
I think you've got time, Bart, for one more question. I assume it's on cathedral builders.
Yes, exactly. So this, let me go that way then. So I've had the opportunity to interact with Jan, during all kinds of scholarly exchanges, but also on a more private level. And many of us have had that opportunity, of course. And one of the things that has always sort of been in my mind, and I've been thinking about every now and again, Jan, is your description of, let's say, the evolutionary economics kind of field. So that's not necessarily the same as the innovation studies field, but let's say the heterodox evolutionary kind of economics field that we operate in. You've described it as being influenced by what you call cathedral builders, and I wonder whether you could tell us what you mean by that term. What is a cathedral builder? What does such a person do? And how do you feel their impact has been on the field? And one thing I would be particularly interested to know is that at this stage, do you yourself consider yourself to be a cathedral builder? That's something I'd be interested in to know.
Thank you, Bart. You know that in private conversation, I was not exactly sure that I ever have said this, but let's take it at face value. If I'm going to say what I mean with cathedral builders, you just have to look at a textbook in neoclassical economics. I mean, it's a kind of approach that is based on very strong assumptions, and then you develop some formal modeling and so on, and based on that, and then you can come to the most strange and irrelevant conclusions that you propagate as being good science. So, and cathedral builders are, so this is the cathedral, and the cathedral builders are those that like this kind of activity. If the notion has some relevance at all. And I think that, the neoclassical economics is that kind of cathedral. And the cathedral builders are guarding it. And they don't want to allow others that think differently and that don't like their ideas to enter their cathedral, say, discipline, or have jobs at university and so on. So that's the nature of the cathedral builders. They are guarding their cathedral, and they're keeping others out of it as much as they can. Are there cathedral builders in innovation studies? I don't think so. I think that in innovation studies, and if we are talking about innovation studies in the tradition of Freeman, there is nothing of that. I mean, it's a very broad community, and that's the strength of it. But perhaps it is a community that could benefit from some more theoretical reflection. Because if it doesn't do that, it may very easily fall apart. At least some basis for talking together, some basic approaches, concepts, and so on. And that is what I try to do with the Oxford Handbook of Innovation. I think I'm if you now, Bart, since you are raising the issue of evolutionary economics, I don't think that evolutionary economics and innovation studies is the same. I think these are partly overlapping areas. So some people that are in innovation studies are also in evolutionary economics and vice versa. And I'm one of them, I think. But I would like evolutionary economics, and I wrote a paper about this in the journal Evolutionary Economics in 2003, Schumpeter and the New Evolutionary Economics. I would like to make an advertisement for that. I would like evolutionary economics to be based on some very basic principles. So that could contribute to innovation studies by giving, some theoretical and conceptual basis. But for example, things like, that Chris Rubin talked about, and that Schumpeter has talked about. For example, the folly on looking just on innovation and not on the introduction of or inventions, and not on the introduction of these in the broader economic and social system and what happens there and so on, and having a holistic perspective on that. And so we have variation and selection, but so I'm totally in line with that. But I do not always see the advantage of making very complicated models that produce very strange results, and that just that they are different from neoclassical models, but still they have the same closeness to their structure. But I will give it the benefit of doubt, but I'm I'm not convinced necessarily that this is a good way to go in the field of innovation studies.
Right. I think now is the time to broaden this out to the audience. I can see at least 2 questions in the chat box. The first is from Sean Cunningham. So Sean, would you like to unmute yourself and put your question to Jan?
Hi, everybody. Hi, Prof. Jan. I'm always very intrigued with your work on measuring technological capability at the level of nations. And the reason why I trust your work is I know you also understand innovation at the level of firms, which is often a bit lacking when people measure things at more abstract levels. But in a way, you've also already answered the question, but Rajesh insisted that I still ask you. Now, given that you also know and love evolutionary economics, the way you calculate technological capability every 10 years in the Cambridge Journal, are you going to change the way you load the factors? And is it necessary to identify more factors, or are you going to stick with what you have now? And the reason why I'm asking this is I often I'm not an academic, I'm a practitioner. I'm working in the evolutionary space where I'm trying to get these things to talk to each other. And what really bothers me is the fact that institutional competencies doesn't always translate very soon. You can ask me how long that is, I'm not sure, into capabilities in industries. And at the same token, capabilities in governance or capabilities in education doesn't always translate into patents. That the interaction between these things is not smooth and it's not easy. So for me, it often feels like the way your technological capabilities measured at the national level then obviously doesn't always represent what's happening in different sectors in a developing country. So that's a very long and convoluted question to say, you're doing this every 10 years. It gives us the benefit of building up data. How do you think it needs to change, if it needs to change?
Well, thank you for the question. I always like to play with numbers and put numbers on concepts, and but it's very difficult. And so the things you would like to measure are not necessarily those things that you can measure, and so on. So I think in this type of work, you have to accept that it evolves all the time, and the kinds of things you do are always imperfect, and you would like to improve it. I certainly would not say that anything I have done, or that Martin Scholek, for example, and I have done, is a kind of end product that everybody has to accept and that is perfect and so on. Quite to the contrary. But the argument that I have tried to develop is that capabilities is a multidimensional concept at the national level and also at the regional level, for example. And that is important, and that those different elements of the capability they are in most cases complements, not substitutes. That means that lack of capability building in one area actually may prevent capabilities in other areas from having the outcome that you would like. Actually, I was MARYANN and Martin and I, we made a paper about this some years ago where I think we advocated that argument with reference to European states and American states and European nations.
Right, can we
Thank
move
you,
on
Prof.
to the next question, please, which is from Carlotta. Carlotta, if you want to unmute yourself.
Thanks a lot, Jan, for a very interesting session and for all the things we discovered about your personal history, which is fascinating too. I'd like to follow on from MARYANN's question about the revival of the role of the public sector and on your answer to BART about how much of government action is actually innovation. I would like to ask whether you think the innovation policy community should study policy innovation as an actual different thing, and whether it should do it with the same intensity as the study of policy innovation was done in the 1980s. Perhaps a SAFO project to identify factors of success and failure. Governments are not moved by competition or competitiveness. Does public policy operate differently? Shouldn't we understand that? I mean, we give so many policy recommendations. Do we really know what people can do with that? I've been a policymaker myself, and so have you. And some of those policy recommendations, frankly, are just pie in the sky. They have no real, I don't think we understand policy innovation, do we?
So with policy innovation, you mean changes in policies, development of new policies, instruments, things like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how to work together. You make consensus. How do you incorporate people? I mean, there are a million things that policymakers need to know how to do, and we don't really understand how they can succeed or how they proceed, the ones that do succeed.
Yes, I think we need to study these issues. And I mean, Jacob Edler and his team in Manchester, they did a great job, and they produced a handbook of innovation policy. So they had where they looked at an enormous amount of different policy instruments and their possible impact. And I think, Sean, you were active in that, or? Yeah. And I think that more work is needed of that kind. And there are too few people working on innovation policy. But my impression is that it's actually this is a type of activity that is increasing all the time. And the way I see this is studies of the development of various policy instruments or policy innovations, as you say, regarding policies affecting sustainability transitions and combating climate change and so on. There's a lot of work ongoing and many younger people active in assessing the role of different policy instruments and what they can be used for and so on.
Right, the next question is Mark Dodgson. Mark, do you want to unmute yourself, please?
Thank you, and thank you very much. What a treat it's been listening to this conversation, and many congratulations to the organisers, the CRIS organisers, for organising such a great event. I think my observation is really going back to the discussion about the future of innovation studies. And I think I was slightly alarmed by Jan's suggestion that it doesn't really matter if management of innovation and economics of innovation goes their different ways. I think it's absolutely crucial that any economics of innovation or any innovation policy is informed by how decisions are made in organizations. And that includes firms, but it also, going back to Carlotta's point about decisions, how policy decisions are made in government by public servants and by politicians. And I always remember Stan Metcalf telling me about the great economist Alfred Marshall. Alfred Marshall went to a different company once a week in order to be able to calibrate his thinking about macroeconomics, regional economics in that case, with what decisions are made by managers in firms. So one of the great virtues of SPRU was the fact that it always combined all those different disciplines. And Chris Freeman, I know, was always very active in supporting research into management of innovation, technology and innovation, and how important that was in informing other parts of the innovation community. And I'd argue that with going back to MARYANN's observation about digital, I mean, unless we understand how firms and governments are thinking about digital and managing digital, then we can't make proper policy. And if we want to look at an example of the impact of those kinds of technologies, just look at China as one of the countries, the only country in the world that's really industrialized in the digital era. And that digital technology is not just process innovation, it's adding creativity, it's doing all sorts of different things. So I think, just to emphasize again, if we are as a community to go forward, there must be a strong connection with understanding what goes on in firms and the understanding of the economics and policy of innovation. Thank you.
Yes, I probably would agree with most of that. So the answer that I gave was, I think, related to a slightly different issue, and that is the working of innovation studies as a field. So I think we have to realize that there always will be many disparate knowledge bases. People will be interested in innovation in economics, in geography, in sociology, and so on and so on and so on. So there always will exist these subsets of innovation studies that actually are elements within various disciplines and other approaches. And there is little to do with that. But what is possible to do is still to try to connect these various streams, and especially those that, you know, try to build a more synthetic knowledge base that does not confine itself within one separate discipline, but that tries to draw on insights from different disciplinary settings. And my simple suggestion was then that to relate to policy was maybe the kind of organizing principle in doing that. So what I suggested was that those that are interested in influencing policy, at least to have an impact on innovation and thereby on economic and social goals, they should try to stick together. And of course, you cannot do that if you are totally disinterested in what is going on in firms. I completely agree with that. But there will probably also be people working on innovation in relationship to firms within the management sector discipline that are totally uninterested in policy. And only interested in strategizing in firms and so on. And at the same time, in economics, there are many people working on various aspects of innovation and patenting and the like, and they are uninterested in the broader issues that the innovation studies community as taking up. So I think of the innovation studies community as a kind of broader umbrella for all this.
Right, next we have a question from Michael Kahn about something that's been missing from the conversation so far. Michael, would you like to unmute yourself?
Thank you very much, everybody. It's a real privilege to listen to Jan and Ben and everyone else. It really is a great conversation. Two things, though, seem to have slipped by. Keywords: public sector innovation and transformative innovation policy. I would have expected to hear more about them. There's Carlotta smiling, thank you. I live, and so does Sean, in a great policy laboratory, and we're painfully conscious that every act of legislation, all acts of regulation, are innovations in their own right, and we need to understand them from a firm perspective, from a social perspective. And secondly, the whole hype, I will say that bluntly, transformative innovation policy, what is new about it? Ben, you've given us a wonderful typology. What's really new? What is this saying that hasn't been said before? So it's really two big things here. Thank you very much.
Yes, well, I think that is a very relevant question. And I have actually written a paper in research policy a few years back, which I delves into it in some detail, and which I may recommend. So I think that what I sense is underlying your argument here is that we need to understand actually what influences innovation activities in firms and public sector organizations and so on in some detail, and that this knowledge is not necessarily entirely new. It has something that has been studied before, and that has led to some important lessons, and we need to continue to have this in mind. While we don't need necessarily to invent everything from scratch every time there is a problem that needs to be tackled. Did I understand you correctly? Okay, then I agree.
Thank you.
Right, we have a question from Rajesh. Would you like to put your question, Rajesh?
Sure. Thanks very much, Jan, Ben, MARYANN, and BART. Great conversation, and I'm sure we all enjoyed it immensely. Jan, I'm particularly intrigued by your sharing your interest in intellectual biographies. Here comes to mind your great work, your biographical work on Chris Freeman. My question is, why are life stories of scholars important? Don't their work speak for them? And whom do they benefit? And by the way, I'm also keen to know what you think about this series of programs. Thank you.
Yes, can I start maybe? But this was also directed to the other panelists, so I think maybe they will join in. well, I have enjoyed to be here, and I think that you get a deeper understanding of people's arguments if you also have an understanding of how they have came to have these arguments. And certainly for me to write a short paper about Chris Freeman and the development of his main ideas together with Ben and others some years ago, that was a very interesting discovery process. Because I went around and talked to a lot of people that had interacted with Chris in various settings. I even went to Paris and talked to some of his former colleagues in the OECD and so on. Some people that had gone together with him in school and that still were alive. And so being able to that, I think gave me a broader understanding. So, of course, more famous people than myself, they have biographies, so that people write about them, and I always find them immensely interesting. And I think that the biography that has been made on Schumpeter, A Prophet of Innovation, is very rewarding reading, and that you actually, by taking into the context into which the ideas are developed, you actually understand the content of these ideas much better, and you also understand their limitations. So I very much would like to compliment you, Rajesh, with this project.
I've certainly got some views on that, but before I offer them, do Bart or MARYANN have any final comments they want to make?
No, not for me.
Let me
Bart,
just say,
oh, sorry.
Bart was very gracious, and I just went immediately to my question, but I wanted to thank you, Jan, for your contributions over the years. And also, you have been so gracious with younger scholars. And I really appreciate your inviting me to different events and to participate. And I think that, ultimately, we are all more than our intellect, right? That there is, I think, in this community, great warmth and great consideration for other people, and understanding individual perspectives is so valuable. So thank you. I actually have to go now because in North America, the day is just getting started, but thank you for including me.
Thank you, MARYANN.
MARYANN.
Bart, you have some last comments?
No, I just one remark specifically to the question on Rajesh that Rajesh asked. I think these biographies are very important. These conversations, I think, are a very good contribution to that. But for me, the thing that really matters in such a biographical piece is to provide also the intellectual side of that in terms of the bigger overview of how these works are connected. And Jan gave us some insights on his personal thing, but I think a good intellectual biography should cover exactly that. I mean, there's individual pieces that you find that people have written, but how do they all fit together if you look back at them, and cover a long period? That's the thing that I would be looking for in those things.
Let me just offer some thoughts also on this question posed by Rajesh, why this focus on the life stories of scholars, and indeed this series of lectures is as much about that as anything. But I was struck by the fact that Jan at the start said he hadn't been asked much about this before, so I was sort of the one guilty of taking him in that direction. And the reason is the following. And I hinted at this at the start, it's the values which are widespread in our field. Values which we take for granted: openness, treating everybody on the merit of their ideas, intellectual generosity. Let me quote my famous example of that. When Chris Freeman was asked, where did you get the idea of national innovation systems from? He said Bent Arco Lundvall. When people asked Bent Arco Lundvall, where did you get the idea from? He said Chris Freeman. You would not get that sort of argument, for example, in a North American business school, where it would be, no, it was my idea, no, it wasn't, it was mine. Those values come from some of the founding figures in our field. Chris, Dick Nelson, Nathan Rosenberg, Bent Arco Lundvall, Jan himself, very open to new ideas, willing to give priority and time to looking after and mentoring younger researchers. Those are values which permeate our community and which we were fortunate to have from our founding parents. Just going back to Schumpeter for a moment, if he had been one of the founders in the 50s, 60s and 70s, I'm not sure if the values would be quite the same. If you're thinking of cathedral builders, I think he was a bit of a cathedral builder in his own way. And if he had been in when the field really got going in the 50s, 60s, 70s, I suspect the values would be rather different. I've seen values in other fields. Before I came into this field, I was in the neighboring field, science and technology studies, where they seemed to spend most of their time fighting each other. And after a while, I just got bored with that and moved on. You're all familiar with economics. I like that notion of cathedral building. Cathedral builders in the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century were trying to build ever higher and higher to get closer to God or universal truth. And I think you can extrapolate from that to economists building ever more into sophisticated structures, trying to get close to universal truth, even though actually the foundations aren't very solid. I'm thinking of the buttress walls that had to hold up the cathedrals as they went higher and higher. Management scholars all intent on writing that blockbuster book that will enable them to get a higher salary and draw in more students for MBA courses and make their fortune and their fame. We don't, by and large, have that set of values in our field, for which we should be grateful. But they don't just happen, and they won't continue unless we take occasions like this to emphasize what those values are, why they're important, why we should be doing what we can to ensure that they are maintained for the benefit of future generations. So that's why I probed a little bit into the background of Jan and where he was coming from. I think it does help to see where some of those values may have begun. So that's my response, Rajesh, to your question. I think, though, looking at the time, unless there's anything else, and I don't see anything more on the chat box, and I'm conscious of the time. So I think that's probably time to hand back to Swati for the ending of this session.
Thank you very much, Professor Ben Martin, for chairing, managing, and the session and bringing more from Jan Fagerberg in this great conversation which we had. The 2 hours earlier, it seems to be long, but for us it wasn't that long. It just finished in it just time flew. And I just want to just share my personal experience. When I started with the field of innovation studies, initially the first book which I come across is again the Oxford Handbook of Innovation, and even that is the thing which I again and again come across whenever I am writing anything. And now I understood that how actually it is so important that the process of its making is quite innovative, and the editor himself is writing the whole things, and that is very fascinating. So these are the things which are actually very important to learn, and that was only possible because of you all who are here. So with this words, I just thanks each one of you who have joined us from different parts of the world and asked beautiful questions, which are actually very important for this conversation. And I thank once again, one and all, Professor BART, Professor MARYANN, she was here, and again, both of you, Professor Ben Martin and Professor Jan Fagerberg. So with this, I say you goodbye, and let's meet in the next conversation series. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.